Well, I'm excited to be here with a group of fantastic thought leaders and from various sectors in the Kent County and Grand Rapids community, and to listen and learn from their perspectives and the work that they do. So let's get right into it. We're going to start with each of you just sharing a little bit about your work and your experience. And if Dr. Upton, if you would kick it off for us.
I'd be happy to. Good morning. So glad to be here. Sandra Upton. I am the founder and chief DEI strategist with the Upton Consulting Group, which is a relaunched DEI consultancy that is designed to really work alongside DEI professionals across the country and across the globe. My transition into this role is very new. I, for the last 7 years, worked as an executive with the Cultural Intelligence Center as the vice president of global diversity practice, and there I was responsible for all of the work that we did around DEI with hundreds of partners around the world. But I've been in the DEI space for well over 25 years, and am really excited about this new stage of work that I plan to do, which is really to focus on coming alongside those who are doing the work and helping them be strategic, be smart, protect their mental health, and really be excited about making a difference. So I'm excited to be a part of this conversation today. Thank you for having me.
Superintendent Poston.
Yeah, I'm Kevin Poston, and I'm the proud superintendent of Kentwood Public Schools. So where are all my Kentwood people at? There we go. Yeah, all right. It's an honor just to be on stage with Dr. Upton and Dr. Chen today. These are amazing leaders right here in the community. Kentwood Public Schools is the most diverse school district in the state of Michigan and the sixth most diverse in the country. Our kids come from over 80 countries and speak more than 90 languages. And so it's an amazing place to be. Diversity for me has been central to my life from the beginning. I am the son of a Palestinian immigrant and a immigrant from Western Tennessee. Trust me, neither one of them spoke English when they came to Lansing. I'm also a first-generation college student, and I sit before you as a doctoral student because at a point in my high school career, an educator believed in me and applied on my behalf, unbeknownst to me, for a program to go into a minority business camp before my senior year of high school at Michigan State. The business gig didn't work out, but I just happened to be at the #1 teacher education school in the country at Michigan State. Go Green. There we go. You guys know how this works. So my job is really to provide the same opportunities that an educator and my family and those that came before me did for myself. So I see my role is to provide that same opportunity. It's a responsibility I take very seriously because I know our kids and families are counting on us.
Dr. Chen, if you'd close us out.
Good morning. My name is Anthony Chen. I have a very unique background. It's the first 24 years I was majority, and after I came here, I become minority. And that's a very, very interesting change. I immigrated from Taiwan, and then before I came to Michigan, that's my second immigration from the Republic of Texas. People ask me what I'm doing. I try to every day, and I try to make it simple. My job every day is trying to use something called a cyclotron to accelerate a particle, make it achieve a quarter speed of light, 4,800 miles per second, and it creates some isotope, emit positrons, and make positron annihilate with electrons, and we can catch cancer. And then we can treat cancer. That's what I'm doing every day. And so I also represent an extreme minority group, and it's totally underrepresented, called nerd. So that's my background.
Well, thank you all. Let's start with you, Superintendent Poston. Where do you see the return on investment in your field of work for DEI?
I'd say first off, I really appreciate Rick and the entire chamber that sees K-12 as vital to our economic and business development. So, I believe our K-12 is our research and development engine for our future economy. The talent development comes from our K-12 system, and we can also serve as conduits in our community for for the type of inclusive growth that we know will ignite future growth in the region's economy. You saw the data about what that looks like. Currently in our country, a majority of students in our K-12 system are students of color. And by 2045, a majority of persons in this country will be persons of color. And so when we think about, our role of K-12 to provide those opportunities for all kids, the ROI is something that we pay attention to. The Kellogg Foundation in 2018 did a study called the Business Case for Racial Equity and said that if we as a state commit to equitable practices, it'll result in more than $90 billion of economic growth for the state. So when we think about what's at stake, that's a race that we can't lose. We have, as leaders, we have members of our community that are counting on us to provide those opportunities. And so what we see from our kids is that brilliance is universal, but access and opportunity are not. And when we provide access, as Marcel was sharing, we get to the outcomes that we all want and that we all benefit from. So it's up to us as community leaders to engage and create those conditions that we can sustain. And there's hope. The data on early childhood education, which disproportionately serves persons of color in our community because they are targeted toward those from lower socioeconomic background, which unfortunately we know are higher populations of persons of color. But what we've seen is when we look at readiness assessments, that children that participate in early childhood education are more ready for kindergarten and thus going to be more successful in their K-12 experience and beyond. And we've also seen programs such as FIRST Robotics or AP Computer Science that provide more equitable access to careers in STEM, where 85% are white and 90% are men. But we know that the development of artificial intelligence must be representative of the communities that we serve if we're truly going to accomplish those goals that we want to. So when we think about what's the ROI, so I think it checks all the boxes of the triple bottom line. It's good for business, it's good for our people, it's good for our community. But I think more so, I think the real ROI is the humanity for those that have been marginalized, hope for the far too many that haven't had it or lost it for far too long, but also the belief that every individual in our community matters.
Dr. Chen, could you respond to that? What's the ROI on diversity, equity, and inclusion in your space?
That's always very, very hard things to measure. We spend a lot of time to trying to see if we can build a metrics to measure that. But to the end, we figure out that that's not really practical, especially for the field we're in. We're a very specialized field. If we want to use conventional metric trying to measure the success, and it's going to be very, very hard for us to achieve. So we want to get back to the core. Instead, talk about tactics. We want to talk about why we need to have it, and also what does that really mean? I mean, I think the core to address these kind of issues is we need to start to focus on respect and trust to people. Period. And after that, all the policy, all the environment we can build around it, we can make people feel like they're belonging to this environment. We can make people feel like they own this project, they are part owner of this company and these kind of missions. And we also address the empathy principles, make people can listen more instead of talk more. Listen to understand, not to respond. It's a very common principles we keep addressing in our company. And based on these kind of basic principles, and then build a policy around it, and then we can we naturally create a very diverse environment to our company. Even we are a very young company, we have about over 50 people so far, but right now we have about over 30%, depends on how you see the data. We have 30 to 50% of our people are from minority groups. And we have around 40% of our team members are females. And we have a very diverse skill set for different group of people to do what we're doing over here.
Thank you both. Dr. Upton, there's a lot of talk these days about the finite game versus the infinite game. Are we playing the long game or the short game? Where do you see DEI practitioners being, and what difference does it make in terms of talent management, talent recruitment, and talent retention?
Great question. First of all, I should have worn a pantsuit. But anyway, I'll survive. I think most of us understand that in the DEI space, it is definitely an infinite game, right? We know that this is a journey. We never fully arrive, but we can absolutely make progress. But we have to take the work very seriously, and, specific to talent management and retention, I was thinking about as I was sitting at the table and listening to some of the other presenters, I was thinking just last week, my husband and I were at a brand new restaurant that just opened up here in Grand Rapids, and we go there, and there's like no diversity on the staff. And I'm looking around, and it bothered me because I thought, here we are again, with everything that's going on, all of the things that we've been talking about and this claim commitment to this work. Here we go again, another organization who had this wonderful opportunity, this restaurant had this wonderful opportunity to hire a diverse team of people to work in their restaurant. And as a patron, that's important to me because when I come in, I want to see people that look like me. And my husband, we were talking about it, and my husband said, well, maybe there are other folks that are black and brown. Maybe they're on a different shift. And I'm like, nah. I said, because, if they were intentional about attracting and recruiting diversity, you're going to see that every time you walk into this restaurant, right? Whether I come in for lunch, dinner, or breakfast. And so it was just such a reminder of how, again, this work is ongoing. It is a process. It is a journey. But we have to be serious about the work. We have to be intentional about the work. Otherwise, it won't happen. And I think the danger in a situation like that, which we see in so many other organizations, is that when you start out and you're not intentional, to catch up is so much harder. Right? It's a lot more work to now try and back up and say, okay, we've now hired 50 people and they're all white. Okay, but now we're going to get serious about this, and now we've got to play catch up, right? And then you get into this whole dynamic of people feeling like there's a zero-sum game. So it's so important to be intentional and to start out up front making a commitment to this work. The other thing that I would say is, and we all know this, but, you can't do the D without the I, right? You cannot just recruit people and think you're done, right? You have to make sure that you are creating an inclusive environment. And even to the diversity thing, it's so important. We often hear this thing about, diversity makes us all more creative and more inclusive, or more creative, more able to work more effectively together. And actually, the research shows just the opposite, that when you have diversity, that alone is not enough. We assume that just because we have this beautiful picture of people from different backgrounds, that's automatically going to make us more successful. And the truth is, if those people don't have the skills, the competence, the intelligence to be able to work more effectively together, then they're actually no more effective than a team that's completely homogenous. So understanding that we have to have the skills alongside the diversity, and then to, of course, make sure that when we make commitments to diversity and we have the numbers, we have the representation, then the real work starts with creating that inclusive environment.
Thank you, appreciate that. Superintendent Poston, can you bring your educator's lens to that question? How does playing the long game versus the short game really impact your ability to recruit and retain teachers and educators?
Talent is everything right now. There we go.
I feel like I'm at church. Thank you. Thank you, Mandis.
I did get the pantsuit memo, though. I did. So we know that talent drives all of our, our businesses, our schools, our organizations, our people. And so when we think about recruiting diverse talent or recruiting talent that is more reflective of the demographics of the communities we serve or lead or are attempting to serve through business, we have to look at the qualifications. We often hear this phrase about we're going to hire the most qualified candidate. Well, who's writing the qualifications? And what are they based on? And do we not include someone's lived experience as a part of the qualifications and what they can bring to the table. And how do we ever disrupt systems that have inherent inequities if all we do is regurgitate the same qualifications over and over? And so as talent, one of the challenges that we are attempting to address at Kentwood is we have the diverse talent in our midst in our school system. Our largest demographic of students at Kentwood is African American. About a third of our students. 15% Asian, 15% Latinx, 27, 28% white. And so when we think about, who we're trying to recruit, how are we looking at providing those opportunities to scaffold our students that are primed and ready to lead this region forward? And providing those connections and access points for them has been a focus of ours so we can get them to those high-need, high-interest careers.
Dr. Chang, pick up on that idea of the opportunities. Where do you see some opportunities for some successes? Where do you see that in your work, and where's the potential growth in the application of DEI in your field, in the field of medical innovation?
So that's a very big question. So as a nerd, I always use like a more physics way to try and explain these kind of situations to help I understand the system. So I always would like to use the second law, thermodynamic law of physics, to see why we need to have a diversity and why it has to be done. So in a very, very high level, what's the second law of thermodynamics? It means the entropy is always going to higher, meaning that the change is always going to happen, and a system is always going to be disorder, moving toward the direction of disorder. And if you want to try to make this system in order, you would have to put more and more energy into it to make the system keep in the current situation. And eventually, the energy you need to put into that system is gonna be extremely, extremely high, and there's no way you can put enough energy into it, so it will either explode or is going to make a very disruptive change by itself. So for running a system, running a team, running a company, in order to make this, the very first thing we need to embrace is, as a leader, is the change is going to happen. It's inevitable. Embrace that first. And number two, how are we going to guide this change into the right direction? And in order to do this, to have diverse team members and embrace the diverse concept is the most energy saving and the organic way to lead the change in a very controllable way, and also can guide the change into the right direction. And so we can benefit from this kind of change. That's how I see why we need to do diversity, purely from a physics point of view. And once you embrace this kind of concept, and you're also going to start to see a lot of benefit from that. If you look at the history, like NASA and the Special Forces, like Navy SEALs, there's the very first group in their organization or in the military systems adapt diverse the concept over there before other branches break those kind of barriers. Why is that? Because these are the group targeting a very, very big goals over there. If you are targeting a very, very big goals, if you're mission oriented, then you're gonna figure out this is the most efficient way to do that, and it's required to achieve your goals over there. And that's what happened to NASA. We all see the movie action, Hidden Figures, and a lot of Navy SEAL movies, and that's why it happened. So I think in an organization, as a leader, what we can do better in the future is, number one, we need to set a very clear goal and direction. And this goal should be big. And as long as the goal is big enough, then this kind of inclusion, diversity things is inevitable. It will happen organically. We don't need to put an extra force over there to force it to happen, to convince people this has to happen. And number two, as a leader in a group I think the culture is incredibly important to embrace this kind of concept. And like what I just mentioned, I think a lot of people talk about you need to make people feel they belong. But the more important thing is, I think you need to make people feel they own part of this project. They own these missions, they own that project, they own part of a company, they own part of a team. So in Banff Health, we have a very quantum concept to all our team members. We say everybody in Banff team, you have two identities. You're both team members, you're both team leaders. And if it depends on the project you are in. If you're in a project I lead, you're definitely a team member. But if I'm in a project you lead, if I'm CEO of a company, I will follow your lead, and you should no hesitation to lead. And in order to have this kind of concept together, then people will feel like not only they belong, but they also they own. When with this kind of ownership, it will make this kind of inclusion, diversity concept happen in your group more organically. And that's how I see things, and that's the direction we're keeping moving toward to.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. Either of you want to jump in on that? Where are some of the places where we can find some successes right now? Where's the low-hanging fruit? And what's the potential for growth? Do we need to think more long-term? Do we need to think about how we create more ownership and belonging? Where's the potential for growth? Anybody want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I think there's lots of potential both in the immediate as well as in the long term. You know, all of us are aware of the Great Resignation. I, in some ways, was a part of that with my transition into my relaunching my own business. But just understanding the data that's out there, I think it's really important in using that data to inform. So when we talk about short-term, responses and strategies, using that data. So when you look at things like, who's leaving the workforce, we had, what was it? I wrote the numbers down, but 34 million people to date have left the workforce in the U.S., just 4 million in the month of September, right? When you begin to break down that data, a lot of those were women, right? And for a lot of different reasons in terms of they're finding balance in terms of families and their children. A lot of them were people of color, and there's a lot of data out there that shows that many people of color who either left, they wanted to start their own because they wanted that opportunity to have their own thing, but those that are staying are very happy to be working remote because they feel like it gives them a break mentally. So I think one of the low-hanging fruits in the short term is for organizations to really pay attention to this kind of data, right, and think about what does that mean in terms of how we need to restructure, rethink, and reengage with people, particularly those from the brown and black communities, and particularly other underrepresented groups.
Go ahead, Doc.
Yeah. What COVID has presented for a rigid system like education is the opportunity for change. We've demonstrated that we could pivot on a dime in March of 2020 and really undo many things that had been, over a century in the making. So the low-hanging fruit, I think, right now is, the change is happening in front of us. And, Dr. Upton, said something earlier about, equity is not a zero-sum game. And there's this fear of loss that if we move the system, that those that have benefited from the system or are winning at the game of education are suddenly going to become, disadvantaged. And that's just not the case. There's enough food at the table for everyone to eat. It's how do we create more inclusive environments in an education? That means how do we design the educational experience of our students in a more reflective way of their identity so they can see themselves in their learning. And to do that, you have to train staff, but you also have to have greater representation of staff. And what the research demonstrates is it's not just students of color that benefit, it's white students that benefit as well. Right. And so this isn't just about communities of color. This isn't just about, the students that have been, or communities that have been traditionally marginalized. This is what's good for all of our communities. And so it needs to be the work of all of us.
And that's what moves us towards that thriving, prosperous West Michigan for all. Right? Dr. Upton, by way of transition here, and I'd like to ask the rest of you to be thinking about your responses to this as well. Who are some of the key people who are inspiring you in this space? Who are some of the thought leaders that we should be paying attention to because they inspire you, they get your attention?
Sure. Yeah, I can think of a few organizations and also people, but the first organization that I thought about was, and they were referenced earlier, but the work that McKinsey is doing as it relates to DEI. I think they, at their core competency is research, and so they have just done, I think, a really good job of digging deep into the research around DEI and breaking that down, looking at it from multiple different perspectives, and so I find that really helpful for me in my work because, again, I think as we make decisions around what diversity, equity, and inclusion are going to look like in our organizations, it should be data informed. And so they've just got a wealth of data that really can help us think through what changes we need to make in our own organizations. So I think they do some great work. At the individual level, there are a couple of folks that come to mind. One is Mary Frances Winters. Some of you may be familiar with her work, an amazing woman who has been doing work in this space for many, many years. And I think what I appreciate about her work is she's clearly incredibly competent, but she's a truth teller. And I think we are at a time in this work, my husband always calls it, we're sort of at this watershed moment, right, where we have to choose how serious we're going to be about this work. And I think she does a great job as she's working with organizations to not hold back. You know, she's very passionate about the work and very committed to helping organizations move forward. But she's no nonsense in terms of really laying out the facts around where we've dropped the ball in this work and how and what it's going to take in order for us to move forward. So I love the work that she's doing. And then in the same vein, you may be familiar with Tim Wise. He's one of those folks that when you come in, when you bring him in, you better be ready for some more truth telling. But I think again the thing that both of them have in common is that they now have the courage. They've always had the courage to really challenge us with fully acknowledging the truth behind where we really are in our organizations around this work and really challenging organizations to do what's really necessary to move things forward. And I think there are a lot of organizations that are not as serious as they should be. So those are a few that really stand out in my mind.
McKinsey's my go-to as well. So.
For a lot.
Either of you want to take a shot at that? Dr. Chang, Superintendent Preston.
So right here in this region, Mercy Health is a great example. Shauna Lewis has been the national example for what inclusive hiring looks like through programs like Hire Reach and through blind screening of candidates through evidence-based hiring practices, is that when we look at what are the qualifications necessary for the job and then we marry it to the qualification of the employee, but then we screen out all of the demographic information of the candidate, what we find is we increase the diversity of our workforce. And then we've also seen upscaling, where we bring in someone perhaps at a certification or associate's degree, and then we provide the additional training, whether it's for a bachelor's or master's degree within that program. So I think the nursing program at Mercy Health is a great example. A caution, I would say, is that those that have been afflicted shouldn't be the ones that are charged with the remedy. That those that are in the dominant socioeconomic and racial group that have power, access, and authority are the ones that have to create the systems of change. And by all means, representation matters, and by all means, we need to have a plethora of voices at the table. You know, so we can point to scholars like, you know, Ibram Kendi as someone who's been in this room before and presented as someone that can paint the way for what policies and systems look like. But ultimately, we need courageous leaders that are willing to confront structures and systems that aren't designed, that are designed for the outcomes that we have, but aren't designed for the outcomes that we want.
Dr. Chen, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I don't really have a specific person, but there's a lot of role models like I experienced in my life, or give me a lot of thought and stimulate that thinking. This is the way. I mean, when I was intern in a hospital, and we treat a lot of head and neck cancer patients in Taiwan, and our hospital is about one of the large hospitals, 4,400 beds. And we have a lot of head and neck cancer patients, and these cancer patients, we don't know why this specific group of people, will have a head and neck cancer. And then to the end, it correlated to the chewing something called betel nuts. And then none of us chewing betel nuts. We just tell people not chewing betel nuts, it doesn't make any change. So to the end, this group is highly, majority of them is actually come from some Aboriginal tribe in the mountains. So finally, we actually have a person actually with a similar background to start tell us why they want to chewing betel nuts. Is it because betel nuts actually make them feel warm in the winter? So when they work outside in the mountain in the winter, when they're chewing it, they feel warm so they can keep working. And then so in order to solve this problem, it's not we're trying to identify another gene, find another cancer treatment, and spend several $1 million and trying to figure out. It's basically trying to have a people share the same background, really understand the reason, and just offer them better ways to keep them warm, better working environment, and ask them not to chew in the betel nuts, and gradually, dramatically decrease the rate of the cancer. So with this kind of example, just start making you thinking how important diversity is, and how important is you need to sit in other people's shoes to think, how empathetic thinking is critical to make this world a better place. So this is actually one of a great example I experienced and impacted me dramatically, and I also want to make sure in the rest of my life I keep open-minded, embrace different kind of culture, different kind of background, different kind of the thinkings. Even I don't agree with you, but I'm really, really willing to understand why you think this way. And back to the root of the things, being respectful and trust people and being empathetic, I think it's going to make this world a better place.
What you're describing becomes some of the language that we're finding more and more relevant in the DEI space, which is paying attention to lived experience, right? And respecting the lived experience. And then understanding that even if you might be in the same location, your situatedness might be different, which is the other word that we're beginning to incorporate into that work. Now, want to shift gears a little bit and kind of do a popcorn round way of answering the rest of the questions that we have. But thinking along those lines of lived experience and situatedness, how do we embed DEI into the systems that are around us or that you work in and represent? How did you get to that point where someone was paying attention, Dr. Chang, to someone with this different experience who could tell you why the beetles were eating the beetles were important, betel nuts were important?
Yeah, I think it's actually it works on both ways. And we always need to make sure we are there to listen, not there to respond. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people think, okay, especially I think in the professional field, we are all very well trained to listen to response, right? When people throw these things, I'm going to hit it back. And when I hear these kind of keywords, I'm going to throw these things. That shows professional. But when you're in a clinic, when you really listen to from the patient's experience, or on the street when you talk to random people, you're constantly going to start realize a lot of things they tell is not from the word they really spoke, right? And so always remind yourself, listen to understand, not listen to respond, is a very, very important thing, and I think a very important first step. Yeah. But on the other hand, when you're trying to communicate with your problem with other people, and don't assume people will be in your shoes right away. Trying to understand where their background, where they're coming from, and what they can understand. Trying to use their language to express things to them, and I think that will make a better communication with each other, and it will make us to understand each other better, and it will actually eventually create a better result. To this kind of situation.
So we need to practice empathy.
Yes.
and we need to focus on effective communication.
Yeah.
What other things do we need to do? Anyone want to jump in on that?
Yeah, and I would actually argue that it's more than empathy, but it's really perspective taking, which is different, right? So I really love the analogy that you gave, but I think empathy is where I'm expressing, feelings about, your experience, and that has its place, but it doesn't really move us towards identifying strategies and solutions. Perspective taking does that, right? So empathy really gets into the emotions of it, which again, they have their place. But perspective taking is really me then choosing to put myself in your position and imagining, right, what those situations are creating for you, right? If I'm in the workplace and you have experienced a microaggression, right? Thinking about not just saying, oh, I'm so sorry that happened to you, and even maybe some tears, that's only going to have limited impact. But when I say, okay, let me really, really think about how that is impacting you and the implications of that takes it deeper. It's perspective taking, which is really a skill. So I think that's an important part of the process and the conversation. In terms of systems change, just jumping to that part of your question, at the end of the day, when we talk about this DEI work, at the end of the day, we're trying to do two things. We're trying to change behaviors at the individual level, and we're trying to change systems. And that change management system that you talked about earlier was absolutely spot on. But when it comes to system change, I am, given the fact that I've worked with so many organizations at so many levels and different industries and around the world, it goes back to leadership commitment and leadership buy-in. And the way I define that is not just, again, the vision statement, but it is putting the resources behind the work, right? So making sure that we're putting the money behind the work, we're putting the human capital behind the work. That is really critical to that systems change process. And so often when I talk with folks that are working in the DEI space, and especially someone that may have just stepped into a role, the two questions that I like to ask them, because it will tell me a lot about leadership buy-in: what's your budget and who do you report to, right? Right, and if you're somewhere down lower in the organization and they've given you a $5,000 budget, that speaks a lot to leadership commitment or lack of. But I think that's important. And then tactically speaking, when you talk about system change, I think the first step is this commitment to doing a thorough review of your current policies and practices and procedures. And it's simply asking the question, do these policies and practices and procedures serve as a benefit to the claimed DEI work that we want to do, or do they serve as a barrier? And if they serve as a barrier, then how do we begin to rethink and restructure and revise some of these systems, right? And then I think another piece is the accountability. So that in order to change systems, that means that everybody across the organization is going to play a role in this, and they're going to be held accountable, and we're going to add some metrics to the work so that it does become sustainable.
Thank you. Superintendent?
Yes, work must be woven between your vision, mission, and values. It can't be a silo. It can't be on Tuesdays we do DEI. It's got to be something that's integral into everything we do, and we have to check ourselves and check our own biases. That's plural. We see what we look for, and that's predicated on our own lived experience as to what we see. So I'll give an example from a district that I served as superintendent for 4 years at Godfrey Lee Public Schools. I have a lot of pride in that community, but for the better part of 90 years, Lee High School's mascot was the Rebels. And until the 90s, there was a Confederate flag in the gym, and the band uniforms had Confederate flags on them, and until 2018, the mascot was a Confederate soldier, and of a school district that was 92% students of color and 95% free reduced lunch. And the way that symbolism was normalized and how the meaning had kind of shifted, but when those students wore athletic uniforms or band uniforms, or they went to college and they're wearing the hoodie and they get there and people are like, what are you doing? And I just think about what those students, unbeknownst to them, because they didn't know the story, and how they experienced that. So I give a lot of credit to the school board in 2018. I was fortunate to be a part of that, examine the mascot, but it was only after they identified what their values and their vision were. Because if your words and actions don't align, you're never going to accomplish your goals. And so when they set a value of equity, and then you examine your system, do we align to that value? And they said, there's symbols that represent us that don't align to that value, so we got to do something about it. And so they examined it through focus groups and surveys, and the surveys show that a majority of stakeholders did not want the change, but yet they did it anyway because, students, community members that felt threatened, that felt that they didn't identify, it was only 1/3 said that they want to change it, but they said that's too many for us to continue, and they made the courageous move to change the mascot. And that was an incredibly challenging thing for them to do, but what Dr. Upton said is it takes leadership. And that school board said, we're going to put our potential for recall or re-election aside, that I was elected to serve and lead, or we were charged with leadership, and we have to be true to our values when we do that.
I like that. I like to talk about aligning our values with our outcomes. What good are the values? I think it was J.W. Marriott, or at least that's who I heard it was attributed to, said if you can't show how your values are operationalized, how they lead to outcomes, then they're not really values, they're just aspirations. And I think that idea of having DEI values, equity values, drive and through alignment to the outcomes is really important. So let's shift gears a little bit. What are the long and short-term implications of doing just that, of creating, holding space for inclusion and equity in our organizations? Who wants to take a first shot at that? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think in the immediate, it may feel a little uncomfortable, right? I think that courage piece that you talked about is so important because you will have those who don't agree, who don't want to make that change. So I think in the short term, it may be this process where it feels a bit, especially from a leadership perspective, it feels uncomfortable. But if a leader of that organization or the person that's leading the DEI work, if they can press through that phase, the long-term, I don't like to call them implications, but I think the long-term benefits are just endless, right? We know that there is extensive research that highlights, when we truly have a diverse and inclusive and equitable work environment, all kinds of performance outcomes spill out from that, right? Whether that's inclusive leadership, whether that's creativity, whether that's innovation, whether that's being more effective in decision making. I mean, the list is just super long. So I think it's a matter of really making that decision early on, having the courage to make the decision that we are going to do this work, we are going to do the right thing, and we are going to take the necessary steps to move the work forward. And that means we're going to be prepared for the resistance, but we're going to press through that. I think the other side of that is quite sweet.
Other thoughts?
You don't have to look far to see that there is, a debate going on in communities across the country at the local level, in particular at school boards, about racial equity. And it's, in some cases, it's torn apart communities. We've seen in Kent County alone, I believe we're at over 30 recall petitions compared to 2 the previous year. And we've lost sight of the ability to have discourse and to disagree without being disagreeable. And can we create a common vision for inclusive growth across sector in this region? Because the stakes are that we all lose if we don't. And that's just not acceptable to have a win-lose proposition, or in this case, I believe it's a lose-lose proposition. So how do we create those win-wins? How do we have these conversations in our communities about inclusive growth? And obviously the short-term, benefits are the sense of belonging and valued and respect that Dr. Chang has mentioned. But think about the innovations that we miss out on by being exclusive. I mean, you have and I have a great deal of respect for Dr. Chang. You have one center in the world. It's unlike anything else in the world. It's right here in Grand Rapids because of the investment for folks that believed in Dr. Chang's work. Or the Moderna COVID vaccine was developed in part by an African-American woman. Mm-hmm. So if we don't create these spaces for inclusivity, our humanity suffers. So how can we get past the sense of loss that some have and to see that we are better because of it and really have these type of conversations in our community about what we truly value? Because when I think we have that, I think we have so much more in common than we have in difference. But we have to be able to have those conversations about what we as a community value, and that will drive us toward the future.
Dr. Chang, would you?
I think this people. I like to go back to your like a finite game and infinite game theory, right? Like I think in the future, the 21st century, no doubt the problem we're facing are bigger and bigger. In order to solve this problem, people need to learn how to collaborate. I mean, if you try to just play with a 0 or 1 game, and everybody is going to lose. So in order to play the infinite game, people need to collaborate with each other. People need to include everybody and who can contribute. So if you look at, I would encourage you, if you have a chance to go to our building right at the Monroe and Fulton. It's called Doug Meyer Medical Innovation Building. We actually include this kind of concept in our building design. The entrance of the building, you will see several very dramatic steel columns to support the hallway. But none of those kind of big columns is perfect perpendicular to the ground. Every column come into different kind of angles. The concept over there is later trying to address in order trying to solve big issues, in order trying to bring the life-saving technology to all the people who need it, make it accessible, affordable. Everybody need to bring in their skill set. Everybody need to collaborate, and together we can support big things. And then so I think that's the key mindset we need to have, and to communicate this kind of mindset is a very, very critical near-term goal to make everybody understand. And then long-term goal is how to really execute this, implement this kind of mindset into our daily operations with every single group, not only within a company, between the organization, between the government and the private sectors, between doctor and patient, between the families, all those kind of things, we need to start implementing this kind of concept. And then we can make these things happen more organically, and then to make things happen. So from my point of view, this is definitely a serious issue, and I think we spend a lot of time talk about how we're going to change the system, how we're going to fight with the system. I agree that changing the system is definitely things need to be done, but the question is, should we fight for the system? Or is there some other way besides fighting can make things happen more efficiently, more organically, make everybody agree with each other? This is the direction we need to go. And I think that's the direction, the tactic we really need to think about in order, instead of just keep thinking about like hit a wall, make it bloody and sweaty and get things dirty. So, and I think it takes a lot of courage to say that, and take a lot of courage to do that. That's I want to share with the room over here.
Yeah, appreciate that. We're almost to the end. Last question, and I want you to put on your Future Think hats for this one, so that 10 years from now, folks look back at this conversation and they go, boy, they were really prescient about that. They were really prophetic in terms of that. How do you see diversity, equity, and inclusion shaping the future for our workforce, for our lives, and for our talent in the next 5 to 10 years? How do you see it shaping that future, developing that idea of a thriving, prosperous West Michigan for all?
All right. That's deep.
That's why we had you
That's
here.
why you're here. You know, so I get the fortunate opportunity to work with kids. You know, I have a get-to job, not a have-to. And when I look at the hope in our kids' eyes about what the future can bring to them, and we know that the systems that are in place are not what they should or could be, and they are perpetuated by adults in the system. And so when you just get back to the innocence of a child and you see and listen to their hopes and dreams and you watch them play and you see the inspiration that they can bring, it lends itself to that we can do this. Mm-hmm. We can do this. These are all learned behaviors that we are attempting to deconstruct. And so what I hope is, if we were to look 10 years back and say, oh my goodness, you know, the Elliott Larson Act now includes LGBTQ+. I can't believe, 10 years. So if we're to fast forward, 10 years, I would hope that we see that diversity, equity, and inclusion isn't a department in a school district or a company, that it's the charge of every leader in an organization that we can't lead without diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that we see that it is normalized within our functions of our work. But to get there, you have to call it out with special attention and additional resources until we get there. And so my hope is that summits like this, that the Chamber hosts and lead, call that additional attention so that 10 years from now, we can look back and say, the attention that we paid, the participation of each person in here made a difference toward a better community.
Yeah, that's great, and I would just add to that, the diversity. I think about some of the comments you made earlier in terms of just, looking at Kentwood Public Schools and the diversity of students. The diversity is already here, right? So we're not waiting for 2044. We always talk about these statistics in the future. The diversity is here. We know that in the K through 12 school system, not just at Kentwood Public Schools, but across the nation, that students of color are now the majority in our school system. So we have the diversity, right? So what I imagine is that we begin to tap into that pipeline early on, especially from a talent, recruitment and a talent acquisition. So often we hear what I call the myth, we can't find any diverse candidates. That is a myth, right? That just means that you've got to put a different strategy in place because they're out there. But part of that process includes what I imagine is building strategic partnerships where you close up what I call the leaky pipeline and build a solid pipeline, right? So you're not waiting until you need to fill a position and then you use that excuse that we can't find someone, but you've already jumped ahead of things by forming a partnership with Kentwood Public Schools. And if you know that you're going to want some engineers in your organization, you're partnering with them and creating programs with them with kids at elementary stage. And so you're working with them all the way through their K through 12 experience. And then by the time they graduate and head off to college, you've got this amazing diverse pool of folks to pull into your organization. So I imagine in order for us to really see this vision of truly becoming a diverse and inclusive and equitable community, that we're forming those strategic partnerships. We're being way more proactive than we perhaps are today, right? And then we're being courageous, not only in the conversations, but in our actions.
Again, from the physics point of view, the change is inevitable. It's always going to move toward the disorder direction. So physics tells us diversity is basically going to make your organization more stable, not unstable. So that's number one we need to remember. Also, medicine tells us once every one individual is exposed to more pathogens, is actually your immune system is actually stronger, so it will have a higher chance to survive. So to embrace this kind of diversity things is inevitable future, and right now it's just how it's gonna happen. It's how are we going to make that change, to be actively embrace that change, to lead that change instead of being led or make the change happen to us. Because that's if the change happened to us while we're trying to resisting it, and it's basically like being hit by tsunami. The result, it will never be good.
I think it was Stephen Frost who said, diversity is a reality, inclusion is the choice. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and your perspectives. And join me in giving a great round of applause and thank you to our panel.